Hello, hello. I am Jay Leeming, and this is Mythic Newsflash number 6. This is the news which stays news, because myth is always happening now. Our story for today comes from the Odyssey. And if the Odyssey is a river, this is a ripple in that river. The story so far. The warrior Odysseus, the arrogant warrior Odysseus, has endured many troubles. He's been schooled by disaster, by monsters, by goddesses, by human women, by storms that have been sent by the gods. He's been schooled in all these things as he journeys from Troy back to his home of Ithaca. We take up our story when he is finally home in Ithaca, but he is in disguise as a beggar because his house, his palace is filled with the suitors, arrogant men who are devouring all the food he has and courting his wife Penelope. And Odysseus has a master plan to drive them from his house, but for this plan to work, he must remain in disguise. He has just been interviewed by Penelope, his own wife, and has managed to convince her that he is in fact a beggar and not Odysseus. And the two of them were there in the firelight of the great hall, the pillars around them, the smoke from the fire rising up into the sky through the skylight there. And Penelope sat in a silver chair, and Odysseus, in disguise as a beggar, was beside her. And then Penelope said, "Eurycleia, come, wash the stranger's feet." And out of the shadows came Eurycleia, an old serving maid of the house that had been with the family for a long, long time. And she came bearing a silver Sidonian bowl and some towels and some water, and she came and put them down, set them down before Odysseus in his chair. And Odysseus flinched and turned away, for he realized in that moment that when she washed his feet, she would look at his leg and she would see the scar on his leg that he'd been given as a boy, and she would know that he was in fact Odysseus, and his plan would be ruined. But it was too late. She was already there with the bowl. She reached out. She was lifting up his cloak, and she looked, and she saw the scar, and she gasped. And in a moment, it all came flooding back, all the memories. She remembered being in that very hall right there during the day, looking out, and there was Anticleia, Odysseus's mother, in the doorway. The two of them looking out under the apple tree outside, and there was Odysseus, a teenage boy, coming home with his father Laertes. And Odysseus was on crutches, his leg was all bandaged up. And when Anticleia saw this, she said, "Oh, my child! Oh, my dear!" And then Eurycleia remembered further back to being in that very hall when Odysseus was just a baby, a tiny baby, and Anticleia, his mother, was holding him like this. And Autolycus, Odysseus'S grandfather, was there in a chair, perhaps that same silver chair that Odysseus was in now. And Anticleia said, Father, it's time to give the boy a name. Give him a name." And she handed carefully the baby Odysseus to her father Autolycus. And he set him down in his lap, and he looked at him. A name, yes. Names are tricky things. Some say a name is how we hide from what we really are. But I will give you a name, dear boy. Let's see. I name you Odysseus, man of pain. "Oh, father," said Anticleia, "that's the name. The gods spoke through my voice. That is the name this boy has. And someday, little man, someday you will come visit me on Mount Parnassus. And there I will give you many gifts, and we will go hunting together through the wild forest there." And in fact, this came to pass. Years later, when Odysseus was a teenage boy, he and his father Laertes journeyed away from Ithaca, across the water, and to Mount Parnassus itself. And they went up through the forests of that mountain, and they stayed there with Autolycus. And Odysseus met his grandfather and many of his uncles. And the next day they all went hunting in the forest, bringing with them their bronze spears and, of course, the dogs. And the dogs went through the forest, snuffling, sniffing, inhaling the flavors of the earth, and in so doing learning the history of every piece of ground they ran over. So they scented tracks that the humans could not see, and soon they'd found the track of a boar, and they followed it, slipping this way and that through the ferns, over dead trees. They went this way and that. Soon they found that boar. It went away. The men followed it with their spears, the dogs barking, and then they cornered that boar in a thicket of olive trees there. And all of the men formed a circle around that thicket of olive trees, all of them with their spears, Odysseus as well, each of them trying to look as fierce as possible, for they knew the boar would rush the man who looked the weakest. So they were all poised there, and suddenly, bam, the boar came jolting out of the thicket and went straight for Odysseus, and went straight to him, caught him by surprise, and the tusks slashed into his leg, and the blood poured out. But Odysseus took his spear and thrust it into the boar, and the bronze spear found the heart of that boar, and the light faded from its eyes, and it crumpled, and it fell and died there on the forest floor. And in a moment, all of his uncles, his father and his grandfather were all around him. They began to doctor him. They began to sing a healing song there into the air. They began to rip up cloth and take plants to assuage the bleeding there on his leg. He was covered in blood. And Odysseus, still in the swim of shock, looked out at the boar there, the dead boar, and he saw the bristles on its snout, and he looked at its eyes, and then he reached out with his hand, and he closed the boar's eyes. And sometime later, his uncles, his father, his grandfather, they lifted Odysseus up and carried him down that mountain to the house of Autolycus. And he stayed there for some time, until he was healed. His leg was healed somewhat, and then, wrapped in bandages as it was, he took some crutches, and he and his father, Laertes, went down the slopes of that mountain to the water. And they got in a boat, and they sailed across the water back to Ithaca. And they came to the harbor, and they walked from the harbor up towards the house. And they came beneath the apple tree there, and there was Anticlia in the doorway, with Eurycleia behind her. And Anticlia looked and said, "Oh, my child! Oh, my dear!" "Just a scratch," said Laertes. So all of these moments came flooding back to Eurycleia there, when she saw the scar on Odysseus's leg. And she gasped, and she dropped his leg, boom, into the bowl, and water splashed everywhere. And she began to speak, it seemed, but Odysseus lashed out with his hand and covered her mouth and said, "Silence, old woman, silence! Yes, it is I have returned, but I must remain secret. I must remain like an ember in the ashes of a fire. Tomorrow this ember will blaze up and drive all the suitors from this house, but it is all ruined if you speak." So she looked at him, and she nodded, and then he moved his hand away. And she looked at him again, startled, surprised, and she took the bowl and the towel and cleaned up all the water there, and then she turned and went away into the shadows. And Penelope, she had seen none of this, for the goddess Athena had made the fire flare up and had distracted her attention. So she turned to Odysseus and she said, "Stranger, perhaps you would like a bed in this house. It is a palace, after all. We have many guest rooms." "No, no, my queen," said Odysseus. "I am accustomed to aches and pains. Aches and pains are my mattress now. I will stay down here in the hall, but thank you very much." "As you wish," said Penelope. And accompanied by her handmaids, bearing torches, she went up the stairs of that hall and up to a door and away into her chambers. And in the corners of that hall there were still a few suitors, drinking down the last dregs of the wine, cackling in the shadows. But all the same, Odysseus went to a wooden bench in the corner, in his muddy, shredded rags there, and he lay down. And he heard the cackling of the suitors there. He closed his eyes, but their cackling filled the air, echoed and rang through that hall, which was his hall. And as he heard their laughter, he schemed in his heart, strategized to find a way to drive all the suitors from his house. And sometime later, those last suitors tottered off into the night. And as the last whispers of smoke went whispering up through the skylight in the top of the hall, Odysseus closed his eyes and he slept. That is your Mythic Newsflash for today. Thank you for joining me. May this story swim in us and around us. Perhaps we are in it, though we hardly know. Thank you.